Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are glad you can join us today for this important conversation. I'm Lena Betker. I work at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, and I'm a member of the Sexual Exploitation Working Group. I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging that the Sexual Exploitation Working Group is based on Treaty 6 land, Métis Region 4, Amiskwaciwâskahikan, the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples who have walked this land for centuries, including people of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, and Nakota Sioux nations, Inuit, and members of Métis nations. As Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, we commit to work together to heal past and present injustices and create a more respectful future. The Sexual Exploitation Working Group is an Edmonton-based leadership group collaborating to create awareness of sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, and its causes and impacts. SEWG includes members from a variety of organizations, including ACT Alberta, Alert Human Trafficking Counter Exploitation Unit, Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society, CEASE, the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation, the Edmonton Region Children's Services, PSECA, Edmonton Fetal Alcohol Network, City of Edmonton, City Council Liaison, City of Edmonton Citizen Services, NET, the Neighborhood Empowerment Team, the Ministry of Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women, Reach Edmonton Council for Safe Communities, and the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton. Today's topic is preventing sexual exploitation of youth in online spaces. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts. Carrie Ellinger holds a Bachelor of Professional Arts in Human Services and has been working in the field of criminal prevention and community safety for almost 15 years. She has long been interested in helping to build communities into thriving and safe places for citizens of all kinds. During her 10 years working as part of the Neighborhood Empowerment Team, Carrie has worked to support projects ranging from safety changes to park spaces, a high-intensity program for at-risk youth, to graffiti reduction. Now, working as part of the Body Rub Center Task Force Implementation Team, Carrie has the opportunity to use her skills alongside the lived experiences of many diverse people to help make improvements to the lives of those working in the adult industry. Grace Schmuland is the Public Education Program Coordinator at the Saffron Sexual Assault Center. She started at Saffron through her love of public speaking. She was spotted by a Saffron employee while she gave a presentation at McEwen University and joined their public education team not long after. She has been with the Saffron Center for almost 2 years now and continues to work to prevent sexual violence through education and awareness. Scott Parody uses he and him pronouns. He is a public educator with the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, and he's been engaging in anti-sexual violence work since 2013. Scott is passionate about working with all types of folks to enhance their understanding of consent and develop their capacities to respond supportively to those impacted by sexual violence. In his role as hospitality educator, Scott also partners with nightlife establishments and festivals to foster a network of safer spaces taking action to prevent sexual violence within the Edmonton hospitality community. We also have Andrea Luby joining us from the Protection of Sexually Exploited Children Act. If you have any questions for our panelists, you can submit them anytime during the presentation using the Zoom Q&A function. And now I will pass it over to Carrie to start us off.
Great, thanks, Lena. So my presentation is going to go briefly over recruiting into human trafficking and exploitation using online spaces, just to give people who are here today an overview of what that process might look like and how it might happen. And then our fellow panelists will get into some more details of exactly what that's looking like. Next slide, please.
Human trafficking is not just something that happens in other parts of the world. It happens in Canada as well. Traffickers recruit, transport, and control people by pushing or forcing them into selling sex or working for little or no pay. They almost always lie about what they really represent. It's up to all of us to do something about human trafficking. The first step is recognizing what human trafficking looks like in Canada. The next step is to share this video and spread the message. Act against human trafficking today. To learn more or to join the response, visit us online at actalberta.org or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
So thank you to ACT for making that video and letting us use it. I think it really speaks well to kind of what we're seeing here in Canada. And if you haven't had the chance, please do check out ACT's website to learn more about what human trafficking does look like and how you might spot some of those signs here in our own communities. So to start with the definition so that we're all using the same kind of language, this is the definition that is most commonly used. So for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be speaking solely about trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. And just to be clear, although the word prostitute does occur in a lot of literature and a lot of common discussions around this, that a child can never be a prostitute. This word is actually no longer in the Canadian Criminal Code at all. If children are involved in the sale of sexual services, they are exploited. Any incidents of an exchange of money for sex when the child is under 18 is illegal, as the child cannot legally consent to that activity. Next slide, please. So these are just a couple of myths that I like to discuss, and I know in this format it's a little bit tricky to have a conversation around these, but the first myth is that only youth who come from a quote-unquote bad family are exploited, when in fact sexual exploitation and trafficking can and does affect any youth from any family. This is a crime that doesn't know boundaries in terms of socioeconomic status, gender, religion, income, or any of those other indicators. The other myth that's quite common that we hear a lot is that human trafficking only happens overseas. It's about bringing people into the country, that sort of thing. But again, this is not true. This is very commonly happening in our own communities, in our own country. And that down there at the bottom, it's a bit of an old stat now, but that in 2014, 93% of Canada's trafficking victims who were in the justice system at that time were originally from Canada. Next slide, please. So these are just some facts, and again, a definition, whereas there is often some confusion between human trafficking and human smuggling. So it is not what you see in the movies. It's not, somebody being put in a container and brought, from overseas, or in a trunk of a car and brought over a border. That does happen. That is human smuggling, but that is not what we're talking about here. What we are going to be talking about is the online spaces. So more recently, 77% of sex trafficking victims have reported that they were first approached online, and that is where their grooming and their recruiting process started, was in those online spaces. Next slide, please. So if, as I said before, it knows no bounds, everyone is vulnerable. Who is most vulnerable? There are some qualities which might lead a young person to become more vulnerable. Things such as living in poverty, homelessness, in and out of foster care, young people with a history of sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, anything that might put a young person at higher risk of being taken advantage of in any sort of way may also lead them to be more vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. Next slide, please. So another common myth I think that's worth discussing is that not all exploited youth are addicted to drugs or alcohol. That is a common tool that traffickers use. But what traffickers pursue is really that unmet need of a young person. So it might be an addiction that they need to fuel. It might be more of those core who we are as human needs that are not being met. So the sense of belonging, family, love, you know, where you fit in the world, all those things that young people are really trying to figure out for themselves. That's what traffickers are really good at capitalizing on and tapping into. Youth who are also older physically, but perhaps developmentally are delayed in some way. They may lack those decision-making skills, you know, that ability to discern whether people are being honest and upfront with them or not. And then, so just really remember that if there is something that you see that feels not right, or you see a youth, you know, that is showing any of these types of things, it's worth having a conversation. It might just open up a great conversation. You know, and it might uncover something deeper that's going on. So if as an adult in someone's life, as a parent, a caregiver, a teacher, just if you see something, just take note of it, ask those questions, take notes if you can, just really pay attention to what's going on in the lives of the young people with who you're connected. Next slide, please. So how can technology be putting children and youth at risk? I think we hear a lot about this, but the real specifics of it are often really hard to nail down. So there's so many apps out there which our fellow presenters will talk about, but I also wanted to mention this instructional guide which we found online, which is a little bit terrifying for me, especially as a parent. But traffickers are really good at, one, sharing information with each other about how to kind of hone their craft and get better at what they're doing, and are often a lot more tech savvy than parents and adults. So they have to stay on top of what's new and what's current and where young people are in order to stay on top of what they're wanting to do. So really, they're looking for people who might have low self-esteem, and young people are really open with what they share on social media. So traffickers are watching for those sorts of things. They will compliment them and tell them they're pretty. If they're feeling unloved, you know, they may pose as a loving boyfriend or a best friend who can give them this life that they've always wanted. So wherever there's young people online, there are traffickers and exploiters there as well. So one tip that we do give for parents or caregivers of young people is to please know your passwords for their devices, for their social media, just in case anything is to ever happen or you have some questions, just so that they know that they're grown up, the person who is entrusted to have their back also has access to that very big part of their life. Also check your kids' social media privacy settings, whether or not they're public. Check your own privacy settings, see how public they are. And just watch for, you know, for your young people to be overly sharing, overly posting about what's going on with their lives, where they're at and what they're doing. Next slide, please. So again, this is just some definitions on recruiting, luring, and grooming. This is the process that traffickers or exploiters will go through to engage young people in what they want to engage them. It's not just an immediate jumping to posting an ad on one of the sex selling sites. It is a slow, methodical process, and unfortunately, those who would traffic and exploit young people are really good at what they do. And as I mentioned before, the most common way and the easiest way for exploiters to access young people is through the internet. So the grooming is really that slow process of getting young people to feel comfortable with them, to feel as though the person really knows them, really gets them, and that they're in some kind of a relationship where they have trust with that person. Predators will often agree with kind of whatever the victim says at this point, making that young person feel like they really get them, they really understand them, that maybe they're talking to a peer. So if, you know, a young girl posts that she's 13 and she's going through all this stuff, perhaps the person that she's talking to will tell her that, like, yes, I'm 14, I understand you, I'm going through the same thing. When in fact, that's not who they're actually talking to on the other end. And like I said, it's a process that that person on the other end of the screen, on the other end of the internet cable, will be piecing together little bits of information over time to really construct a picture of their victim and where they're at and what they're needing. So it, again, like I said, it's a slow process. And the next slide, please. So it really starts with that recruiting, and then into the luring, grooming. Sorry, my daughter is home with me today. So it has to be this process, because if somebody approached you on the street and just asked you to sell access to your body for their benefit, it would never happen. So it has to be this process of trust building, relationship building, connection, and then moving to that control and exploitation of another person. Next slide, please. So the reason we are seeing such a growth in this in Canada is that, frankly, there's a lot of money to be made, unfortunately. The big money-making thing for you know, criminals and organized crime used to be drug dealing, but that is a product which you take a lot of risk in getting. Then you also take a lot of risk in keeping it and storing it, and then again when you sell it, and then once you've sold it, you're out of your product. Whereas in human trafficking, the product stays and can continue to earn money for that trafficker. So it's a very lucrative business for those who are involved in this. Next slide, please. So then the question is, who is exploiting young people? Who are they? What do they look like? There is often a picture that people have in their minds of who this would be, and it's often very much based in stereotypes and pop culture and lots of discrimination all kind of wrapped up into one. We often picture exploiters or traffickers as African American men, gangsters, a little like kind of lower class. You may have a picture in your mind of how they might dress, very much based on pop culture, music, that sort of thing. And what young people often think who they are is like the rich, well-dressed, fancy, flashy clothing, money just flying around all the time, that very glamorized look of what is often referred to as pimps. So who is it actually? And again, if we were doing this in person, it would be a lot more engaging. But often traffickers or those who would exploit and recruit young people are women. They themselves may have been exploited or trafficked and now have been looped into doing the same to others. It's online, it's a boyfriend, family. It again can be anyone. Peers, people in the same social groups may also inadvertently or on purpose recruit others in, because at the time it's a lifestyle, it's the freedom, it's that connection that they've really been looped into that luring, grooming, connection stage, and they want that for their friends as well. Next slide, please. So then what do we as adults in the lives of young people do? How can we protect them from becoming victimized? So really listen and be proactive, just the same as you would with connecting with your young person. But I think the most important thing is that for those of us who are maybe a bit older and aren't totally up on all the newest apps and where young people are hanging out online, we really need to know those things. We need to know how to operate them, where they are, what they're doing, and have some really firm boundaries around those. Knowing that it's okay to say no to your kids about, just because all their other friends are on a certain social media platform does not mean that they need to be. And really have open, honest conversations with your kids about sex, about relationships, about boundaries, and just foster that ability to have open and honest communication. And I think one of the things that is a real big shift in thinking, I mean, I was born in the 80s and all we heard about was stranger danger, and it's not some guy driving around on a back alley picking up kids. That's, I mean, it's scary. It's what you want to latch onto, as you know, and really talk to your kids about. But that's not the reality of the world that we're living in right now, unfortunately. So if kids are only hearing about stranger danger, then they're really missing a big part of the risk that does exist for them. Next slide, please. So again, just really have these conversations. So talk to your young people about online safety. Privacy is so important. If you wouldn't, share your most personal information with some stranger at the grocery store, maybe you want to think twice about putting it out online as well. I always say, if you wouldn't say it to your grandma, don't say it online. So I think just having those conversations about where those boundaries are in terms of what's okay to share and what's not are really, really important. Simple action, like physical steps you can take, are things like keeping your computers and other internet connected technology devices in public spaces in your home. So no computers in bedrooms. If they're going to be on iPads and phones and stuff, try and ensure that they're doing that in a public space in your house. Cell phones, have a central charging place for them, where at, there's a 10 o'clock phone curfew, they all need to be plugged in the kitchen. And really check the apps that your kids are using. There's lots of great things now that you can put on your internet at home that limits the time that you're allowed to be on the internet and what kids are allowed to access. So just check out some of those things. And then, like I said before, the passwords, usernames, all those things, and check them. You don't necessarily need to go through their entire social media, because kids post a lot of stuff, but check that they haven't changed those passwords on you after you've given them to them. Next slide, please. So there is lots of ways that you can set up, your internet, whatever browser you're using, your iTunes, all those sorts of things. There's some really good controls that go right on your modem now that you can access. So figure out what devices you have and how to set them up safely. And then also get to know some of the lingo. This slide is probably outdated now because it changes so often. And if there's any young people watching, they're probably laughing at me for all of these shortcuts, because they're probably just so out of date now. But there are some good resources where you can look and see what kids are posting and what it means, all these shorthand stuff. And again, like I said, I was born in the 80s. This is not my jam, but they are using shortcuts to talk about stuff that we then often don't have any clue what they're talking about. So if you do see a bunch of this shorthand on your kid's phone, just take the time to Google it. You'll be able to figure out what it means. Next slide, please. So some of the impacts of sexual exploitation that we see, it impacts, kind of every aspect of the young person's life. It can really take over their life in a very quick, insidious way. It just has a way of going across the board. So emotional, social, and even criminal aspects. Although youth can't be criminalized for being sexually exploited, as they used to be. If they do then, kind of flip the tables and become involved in the sexual exploitation of others, then that's where it may impact, their criminal involvement. So really just try and talk through some of these consequences, because kids don't have the brain development to really do that forward thinking in terms of the full spectrum of consequences that they might experience from this. Next slide, please. So just like there's impacts on young people, there's going to be impacts on parents, caregivers, grown-ups in that person's life. You can experience any or all of these things at any range of time. So just know that there is counseling and supports available for both youth and their parents. If this is something that has impacted your family, please reach out and seek those supports. And we do have a list of supports at the end of this presentation. So that is all for me. I will turn it over to Grace from Saffron now.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie, for that first. I think that's a really good just overview of, a lot of terms and things. And so you'll probably be hearing some similar things being echoed in my section of the presentation, but I'll be getting into more sort of specific apps and places that predators might be using to target youth. So next slide, please. So social media in general, something I want to talk about first is firstly how boundaries can be twisted online. I think this is something that Carrie mentioned that's really important as well, that behaviors that we would consider completely inappropriate and totally crazy in person can suddenly seem acceptable online. And so one example I've shared in presentations I've done with youth is where I would say, let's say you have a crush on someone at school, someone that you really, really like, and you want to show them how much you like them, right? So you come up with this plan and you go up to them in the middle of the hallway at school and you take all of your clothes off. You just get completely naked in front of this person. And normally the reaction I get is just roaring laughter, people being like, oh my God, are you serious? There's no way I'd ever do something that's so embarrassing. And that's kind of the idea, right? And that's not a normal response for most people when we like somebody. But then I challenge them and say, now imagine, you have a crush on somebody and you're talking to them and they ask for a nude photo. Is it as strange to send someone a nude photo? Is that something that maybe people are more likely to do? And most of them are, a little quieter and acknowledge that, yeah, that happens, right? That's something that happens. And so, taking a nude photo is similar behavior to taking all your clothes off in public. It could actually, as a photo, it could be saved, it could be shared even more widely. And yet suddenly when the behavior is online, it's something like, oh, that's not as shocking as the other example. So it's important, I think, to remind kids, be mindful of boundaries online, even though something might feel comfortable enough to do online, even if it seems a little like inappropriate. It's important to sometimes imagine, as Carrie said, if it's not something you'd share with a stranger at the grocery store, if it's not something that you're going to show to your grandma, that kind of stuff should remain offline, right? I think reminding kids of what those boundaries look like is really important in general. Another good thing to know about social media is that we do grant licenses to what we post on social media. So this is more about the company, but knowing that we do give up a certain amount of control when we're posting things online. They have the right to copy and distribute what we post to third parties and things like that. So even though we do own what we post online, we do not have full control over what we post online. And, things can be screenshotted and shared. And so it's important to remember, even when we do have good privacy settings, being mindful that the internet is forever. And so if you're posting something online, it's likely that it will exist on there. Even after you delete it, a copy of that is stored somewhere. So another really good reason to be mindful of what you're posting on the internet. A couple of tips, and I'll be probably reiterating these two throughout the apps, but having good privacy settings, like Carrie mentioned, is really important. I'll be talking more specifically for each app because they often have slightly different privacy settings, but honestly, as strict and as strong as you can make them is really the safest way to use social media, especially for youth. And if they do run into inappropriate accounts, someone tries to send them an inappropriate message, whether it's a stranger or a friend, it is important to report those accounts, block them. And ideally, that's also a conversation you have with your kids as you're helping them. Hopefully, you know, having that open communication is so important. So if they do get an inappropriate message from someone, they know that they can come to you as a parent or a caregiver and discuss sort of what the next step is to take, or have that conversation together. It's really important to have open communication with kids about social media and the dangers of it, so that if something does go wrong, they know who to come to, and they know that you'll help them with whatever situation they're dealing with. Next slide, please. All right, so Instagram, of course, is quite a popular app. You can share pictures on there. There's also a messaging service. And so a study that was done around online grooming found that Instagram was used in a third of grooming cases where the method was disclosed. So it's actually quite a popular app for grooming and for predators to target kids. They often use the message feature and comment sections to reach out to children. So you can see an example there on the slide. And they can send quite inappropriate things as well. One issue with Instagram is, even if you do have a private account, accounts that, you know, that don't follow you, for example, they can still send you messages. You have the option whether or not to view them or delete them, but they still can send you messages or photos that could potentially be seen by kids. So well, it's something I would encourage you to consider with Instagram. Not only having a private account, that is a good security step, but there is a way also to filter messages. So there's a filter that you can turn on that will only allow them to receive messages from people that they follow. And so ensuring then that, you know, they know everyone that they follow, they keep that pretty closed circle that can prevent complete strangers from messaging them and sending inappropriate, you know, messages and pictures like the one on the slide there. So I really encourage good privacy settings. And then also having a private account means that only people that they choose to allow to follow them can comment on their posts. So that just makes Instagram a little bit safer for youth as well. Next slide, please. Then, of course, there's Snapchat, right? So you've probably heard of this one. One of the main features of Snapchat is that when you send a snap, a picture or a video or a message, the idea is the person who receives it can only see it once, right? So they open it and then it goes away and then it's gone forever. Now, the nature of this disappearing snap can make users more comfortable with sharing things that they wouldn't on other apps. So it's a very common app for sharing nude photos because users think, well, I'll send it, but it's no worries because it's going to disappear later. And that's, of course, not actually true. Everything that's sent on Snapchat is stored by the company. And also, when things are sent through Snapchat, it is possible for people to take screenshots of them, right? So someone might send a nude photo. The person they send it to takes a screenshot, now has a copy of that photo. There's also a way to do this without sending a notification. So you're supposed to get a notification when someone takes a screenshot, but there's ways to prevent that. So someone could be sending pictures or messages to someone and imagine that they're all disappearing, whereas the person on the other side secretly has them all saved in a folder. So unfortunately, this is something that can happen, of course, with strangers. But as Carrie mentioned, it's important to think beyond stranger danger because unfortunately, I've had a number of conversations with teens when talking about sending nude photos, for example. This is something that's often done with people that they do know. And I've had teens confess to me that, yeah, they had nude photos sent to them on Snapchat and they did save them and they kept them and they showed them to their friends. And so this, of course, can also lead to some online exploitation in that if these photos get out onto the wider internet, now all of a sudden this is available to a whole range of people, as you can see, for example, in the headline that I have up there. Snapchat is also prone to getting hacked. And so images that are saved on there can be shared, and that's obviously something that we want to avoid. So really encouraging, and I believe Scott will be talking more about this when it comes to sharing nude photos and things like that, but really emphasizing that it's that it's very inappropriate for youth to be doing. It is illegal, and it's not safe to be doing those kinds of things, so that youth really have an understanding of how to use apps and send photos in an appropriate way. And another thing that I encourage them to turn off is the Snap Map. That can display their location with others in real time. And so that could just be a dangerous thing. If they're chatting with somebody online, that person, if they have the Snap Map on, they could see exactly where your youth is, and that's updated as they move. And so that could potentially be quite dangerous as well. Next slide, please. So, oh, sorry, back one. Thank you. Okay. Oops. we're just trying to get to, there we go. We're trying to get to TikTok. So TikTok is one of those apps that I get a lot of questions about since I talk a lot about internet safety. And so TikTok, unfortunately, is quite a hotbed as well of predators online. There have been a number of articles discussing how predators are on TikTok. As Carrie mentioned, predators go and people who want to exploit kids, they go where kids go. And TikTok is extremely popular with youth. And so they're often found on there. And as it says on the slide, comments on TikTok are often centered on talent or physical appearance. So that makes it easier for predators to exploit kids that want to impress the online audience. So Carrie mentioned this as well, but they're complimenting them. They're saying, oh, you're so pretty, you know, you're so talented and all this kind of stuff, encouraging them to open that conversation with a stranger predator. And that's starting that process of potential exploitation. So another issue with TikTok is the For You page. That's the page that you will see if you just go on TikTok. That displays content based on users' interest. That's how the platform works. So if a predator were to follow lots of children, they would be recommended more similar content. So the way that TikTok suggests content makes it easier, unfortunately, for predators to find what they're looking for. It sort of does that for them, which is really unfortunate. So one suggestion I have for TikTok, just based on personal experience, being on the app and seeing inappropriate, you know, there's a lot of inappropriate like imagery and things like that, the chance of running into a predator and you know, all that. I personally recommend it for older kids. So this is something that I just sort of made up, but 16 and older is where I would set TikTok, just based on all the issues that it has with privacy settings and predators and inappropriate images and a lack of filtering. There's so many things to be worried about on TikTok that I think it's best to save it for older kids or even adults, ideally. And on TikTok as well, turning on the strongest privacy settings you can. So there is a way to turn off comments, which, you know, obviously can help prevent predators from trying to contact kids, and making videos private so that if someone doesn't follow them or isn't their friend, they're not able to see what they're posting, which is another big privacy issue, right? So turning on privacy settings, turning off any method of other people being able to contact them, that's essentially the safest way to use TikTok. But I would still recommend it mostly for older kids as well. And the next slide, please. Right, so Omegle and Chat Roulette, they're not necessarily social media per se, they're live video chat sites. So if you were to go on Omegle or Chat Roulette, you turn your camera on, you have your mic on so people can hear you, and then there's also a chat function. So the whole idea behind both of these sites is that they are ways to interact with strangers. That's like the slogan, talk to strangers if you go on this site. Now, of course, parents can probably immediately see why that's not a good idea. Connecting with strangers on the internet is dangerous in and of itself. And Omegle is, and both sites are quite popular with predators as well. So Omegle has had such a problem that they actually warn directly on the website, predators have been known to use Omegle, so please be careful. So it's enough of a problem that they feel the need to include that sentence, but they don't necessarily do anything with that issue, right? They don't ban predators, or at least it doesn't seem that they're doing that as much. Chat Roulette is also well known for that sort of similar behavior and extremely well known for male nudity. Although the creator has recently said that they're trying to filter content, it's still a pretty inappropriate website in general. And unfortunately, one issue with both of these sites is they sort of come in and out of popularity, but with the pandemic, kids being bored at home, and also TikTok challenges where kids go on Omegle and talk to strangers, there's been a huge spike in the amount of kids that are going on these sites. And then, of course, a huge spike of predators tends to follow. So these sites should definitely be avoided altogether. And ideally, through apps or other means, blocking these sites through parent controls, I really recommend it because they are very dangerous sites for youth. Next slide, please. When it comes to video games as well, some people don't consider these as much as a way to contact kids, but it's very common. See in the quote that I found in an article, according to New England Journal of Public Policy, contact with online predators can happen in chat features of multiplayer games. So World of Warcraft, Minecraft, Roblox are some of the examples they mention. So avoiding in-game video in-game chats for video games is one of the best ways to sort of work around that, so that they aren't being able to talk to strangers and aren't being able to be contacted that way. I offer you consider using, a third-party app like Discord. So this is one that's separate from the game, so they have to add friends. There's a lot of parental controls and private chat rooms, so they can talk to their friends while they're playing a game, but strangers aren't able to get into those chat rooms. So then they can turn off all the functions in the video game and only chat with their friends as they play. That's one of the safer way to play video games. And next slide, please. So what are some red flags in conversations, whether it's happening in social media, video games? Of course, any conversation with a stranger online is probably a red flag in and of itself. But some specific things you might want to look out for, as Carrie mentioned, as a parent, you can go through their social media, going through their messages if you're concerned as a part of a safety method. So really big red flags from predators are asking for photos to determine age. They want to see what youth look like, see if that's the kind of youth they want to be talking to, so they often ask for pictures. Asking questions specifically designed to explore level of parental monitoring and location of device. Essentially, they're doing a risk assessment of how likely is it that someone's going to find these messages. So as Carrie mentioned, having devices used in public places, in a living room, in a central area, that can really help with that. But if someone's asking about it, it's definitely a red flag. They might send photos of themselves as well. So it is a tactic that predators use online, where they pretend to be younger or are a different person. But often they'll send photos just of exactly who they look like, trying to appear non-threatening, nice, clean, sort of the opposite of what children imagine predators to be. So they get a picture of a relatively nice, well-dressed, polite-looking person. They might think, oh, okay, well, this isn't that bad. They don't look that scary. So they're doing that to try and make the child feel more comfortable and sharing more with them. Of course, bestowing gifts often that can be redeemed online, right? So sending gifts to your house might be too noticeable, but they could send them gift cards or video game gift cards, things like that. Anything that could be redeemed online without parents' knowledge. That's something that they will do, as once again, to try and sort of ingratiate themselves with the youth. And then also using language to try and assure the child that he or she shares a special relationship with the predator. So like Carrie mentioned, they often try to target kids who have lower self-esteem or feel like they want someone to love them and be in love with them and that kind of thing. So they'll use this language to ensure, we're best friends. I love you so much. You can share anything with me. That's a way for them to try and gain the trust of youth. All right, next slide, please. So some safety tips for parents. These are kind of tagging on to what Carrie mentioned, but open communication is so important. Along with all the other rules that you're setting, open communication is just something that they need, because if something does go wrong online, which it can happen, right? Just knowing that you're a safe person to go to, you can talk to them about things. Even, kids sometimes feel embarrassed or ashamed if they receive inappropriate messages from people, but knowing, if you're ever concerned about something online, come and show me. We can talk about it. Sort of reducing judgment and shame, making kids feel comfortable coming forward is super important. Also setting boundaries, of course, so having rules around social media, whether it's an age limit, time restriction, privacy settings. I really like the idea that mom and dad or other caregivers have to have the password and username so you're able to check in. So making those kind of boundaries mandatory before they're allowed to be using devices. Talking about healthy relationships, that can help them, like Carrie also mentioned, talking about sex, being open about it, showing them, this is what appropriate behavior looks like, this is what inappropriate behavior looks like, so they're able to recognize that for themselves. Being collaborative is also important. So studies have shown that the more that youth feel involved in even creating rules around screen time and social media, the more likely they are to listen to them. So creating a contract with them, for example, that they can sign of like, these are all the rules I'm going to follow when I'm online. And of course, listening to youth, right? So being open, learning about what they're up to, staying up to date on social media and video games. And of course, and if they ever come to you with concerns, just taking the time to listen to them and work through that with them so that they can also gain some understanding about internet safety from your perspective as well. All right, so I think that's the last slide from me here. And I'll turn it over to Scott for the last little section of our presentation today.
All right, great. Thank you, Grace and Carrie. So today I'm going to be talking with you about non-consensual photo sharing and youth. It says and youth, but I'm more specifically talking about photo sharing between youth. So I'm going to be highlighting some statistics and laws around photo sharing, and I'm going to discuss how consent practices, or rather their absence, are implicated in this issue among youth. I'll also go through the SACE approach for responding to non-consensual photo sharing and supporting youth who have experienced it. So this is part of a session that I give that's normally 2 to 4 hours, so it's been highly condensed into 15 to 20 minutes. But if you are interested in more information, more in-depth information, or the full session that we offer, you can always go to our website, sace.ca, and all of our contact information is there for booking a session, or there's lots of information that's available in our Learn section as well. If you could go to the next slide for me. So first off, I'm going to start with some stats. So a common misconception about photo sharing, also known as sexting or sending nudes, as I think Carrie and Grace have alluded to, is that when it comes to teens, this is something that absolutely everyone is doing. However, when we look at research that's been done around this, we see that this isn't really the case. So of teens aged 12 to 17, approximately 1 in 7 have reported sending a photo of themselves that was intimate in nature. So this works out to being 14 or 15%. So it's a lot lower than sometimes people think it would be. On the other end of the phone, 1 in 4 teens reported having received a sext sent by the person who was in that photo. So it's kind of interesting to note that this number, this 1 in 4 number, is much lower, or sorry, much higher than the number of youth who reported having sent a photo. So there could be multiple explanations for this, but one is that the amount of teens that say that they have sent a photo of themselves is underreported compared to teens who say that they've received it, because youth who are sending pictures are maybe worried that they're going to get in trouble or be judged, or they've been told that sexting under all circumstances all the time is illegal no matter what. And that is also a really common misconception that a lot of youth as well as adults have about photo sharing. So I'm going to go to the next slide now. So I want to talk about what the law actually has to say about photo sharing. And in Canada, there are 2 pieces of law that address intimate photo sharing among youth. The first, of course, is child pornography laws. And child pornography is referred to as photos, film, or videos of somebody under the age of 18 or being depicted as being under the age of 18 who are depicted as engaging in sexual activity or in a sexually explicit way. So this could include them without their clothes. This could include partially clothed. This could even include somebody who's fully clothed but posed in a very sexually provocative way. So charges around child pornography can be laid for producing it, possessing it, distributing it, or just accessing it as well. And what makes something child pornography is the age or perceived age of the person who's being depicted. The age of the individual possessing the picture doesn't actually matter. So technically, teens sending sex among themselves, amongst their peers, still falls under this law. However, there's been an addition to this law called the intimate photo exemption that says that youth will not be charged for sharing consensual photos of themselves that are intimate in nature with each other. So SACE has worked with a lot of Crown prosecutors, and we've been assured time and time again that this child pornography law is not used to criminalize youth engaging in consensual sexual behaviors. However, these laws have definitely been used to press charges when photos are sent maliciously, or where blackmail or coercion was used to extort more photos out of the youth or sexual contact of the youth in some way. One other piece of legislation that I would like to offer up to you is Section 162.1 of the Canadian Criminal Code, which, because our youth are all going to become adults one day, is really good to know about, because it means, or what is said in this section is that it is illegal to spread intimate photos of somebody without their consent, regardless of their age. So this is good because child pornography laws are really specific to people under the age of 18, and this law provides protection to everyone who is going through photo sharing. So what these laws essentially are emphasizing for us is that it's not the exchange of intimate photos that is inherently harmful. It's the conditions under which these photos are sent. So maybe an adult is extorting these photos from a child, that, as our other presenters have noted, that can be very, very harmful, and it's always illegal. And also if there's manipulation or a violation of a person's boundaries, when it comes to photo sharing, that's what makes this behavior harmful. So if you could go to the next slide for me. So unfortunately, this is something that we're seeing happen for a lot of youth. When it comes to sending a sext in the first place, 51% of girls and 21% of boys reported that the only reason that they sent a photo was because of pressure from a peer. And often this pressure comes in the form of peer pressure or guilting, this idea that everyone is doing it, why don't you want to do it? Or there's something wrong with you for not wanting to do this, or we're in a relationship, so you kind of owe me something like an image of yourself that's sexually provocative in nature. And this gets used to manipulate or coerce youth into sending a photo. So that's why it's really helpful to have some accurate information about photo sharing with teens, and to be able to share with them that actually this isn't something that everyone is doing, even if they have that perception, and that they know that they can absolutely say no if somebody is asking them for a photo like this, and that they have to respect if somebody doesn't want to send or receive an image like this as well. So after a sext has been sent, whether that was sent out of pressure or whether it was sent voluntarily, non-consensual photo sharing can still happen. It can still be harmful. And this happens in the form of the sext being distributed to others without the permission of the person in that photo. So we have some stats on that as well up on this slide. It says that 1 in 4 teens had a sext forwarded without the permission, and 1 in 6 teens reported having been the ones to forward it. So there's also some stats here as well that say that this includes, for the 1 in 4 stat, 20% of girls and 26% of boys. So there's some interesting gender dynamics there that kind of challenge some stereotypes or conceptions that we have around this. I'm not going to touch on that within this presentation, but if people have questions around that, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A as well. So if you could go to the next slide for me. So these stats give us a better understanding of what non-consensual photo sharing can look like for youth. And for some adults and for some youth as well, they can be alarming and they can raise anxiety. And sometimes people feel like, I don't have any skills to deal with this. It's not like anything that we've faced before, but we've been working with youth who are engaging in sexual activity for generations, right? Youth have always been interested in exploring this type of thing. And every aspect of our lives has really expanded to include an online component. So if we think of the way that we interact with our friends, the way that we form relationships, the way that we go to work, dating and sexual experimentation for people of all ages has grown to include an online component as well. And this is what sexting is essentially. It's online sexual experimentation. And just like face-to-face sexual interactions, online sexual contact can be consensual, or it can definitely be abusive, right? And just like face-to-face sexual contact without consent is sexual assault, online sexual activity without consent is a type of sexual violence too. And often this sexual violence takes the form of sending or forwarding a sexually provocative picture without consent. If you could go forward for me. So I know that this is a concept that, or a definition that might be familiar to a lot of people here today. But I want to talk about consent because it's what separates mutually enjoyable, healthy sexual activity from sexual activity that is a violation of somebody's rights that is really harmful. So consent, as it's defined in the Canadian Criminal Code, is a voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. And you'll notice that up on that slide, the word voluntary is bolded, it's highlighted, and that's because it's so important to understanding what is consensual and what is not. Because a yes or an agreement that is given to engage in sexual activity is only consensual when it is given out of the person's free will and without the presence of coercion. So even if somebody eventually gives in and sends a photo, if that photo was obtained through coercion, so I'm talking about guilting, threatening, blackmailing, pressure, manipulation of any kind, then that photo was obtained without consent. So then that's when it would become illegal. That's when it would be breaking the law. So furthermore, the responsibility and any legal repercussions related to the coercion lies with the person who extorted the youth or the person who used coercive behavior to get that sexual image from the youth, and not with the youth themselves who was coerced. I'll go to the next slide. Beyond coercion, I want to talk about a few key elements of consent that apply to all forms of sexual activity, but I want to talk about specifically how they are implicated with photo sharing. So consent for any sexual activity has to be mutual. But when we talk about photo sharing, this means that everyone is okay with both receiving the image as well as sending it, right? So this means that somebody who is okay with sending a sext to themselves needs to make sure that the person who is on the receiving end is also okay with receiving it. So there's no unsolicited photos, there's not dick pics or anything like that that's going on, like we often hear about from different social media sources, or maybe from the, depending on our age, we hear about that from people who are engaging in online dating. Consent is also person specific. So when somebody sends a photo of themselves to one person, they've only consented to that one person seeing their photo. So just like somebody who has consented to kissing one person hasn't consented to kissing anyone else, somebody who has consented to having their photo seen by one person hasn't consented to anyone else seeing it. So all that is pretty intuitive, I hope, but I'm going to go over a few more points about consent as well. So if we could go to the next slide. So consent is also ongoing. So this means that for something to be consensual, it's not just permission at the beginning of it. It's not just that voluntary agreement at the get-go. People have to be in constant agreement for that to be consensual. And that means that somebody has the right to change their mind. And this is really deeply implicated with photo sharing. We know that often people are saving these images, and even after like a breakup or something like that, they're then spreading those images around. But for consent to be ongoing, like I said, it needs to be something that they agree to at all stages. And this could apply to any type of relationship. So at any point where somebody feels like, hey, I sent you that image, but I'm not comfortable with you having it, then the person who is in possession of that image has to delete it, or that's when they would be at the point where they are engaging in child pornography and breaking the law. Consent is also never assumed. So all this to say is that consent is not something that we can take for granted or make guesses around. So we can't assume that if we sent an image to somebody that they're okay with that we're okay with others seeing it. We can't assume that somebody is okay with receiving an image from us. We can't assume that somebody is okay with having their photo taken if they're in a sexually provocative situation. We have to get their permission to send that or to take that image as well. We also can't assume that if there is a photo that surfaces of youth engaging in sexual activity, that what happened within that photo is consensual and not coerced, right? So sometimes when these happen, when things like this surface, we tend to say, how could that person be involved in something like that? But we don't have any indication just from a photo that they weren't being coerced into that. So we really want to avoid blaming people for just having these photos surface. If you could go to the next slide. So now that we know more about photo sharing when it's non-consensual or when it's consensual, I want to talk about how we can respond to youth in the aftermath. A lot of this is going to overlap with things that Carrie and Grace talked about, because we all really want to emphasize that open communication, that open dialogue that you have with youth about this, and making sure that they understand what their rights and responsibilities are. But if we could go forward, I want to talk about a few things from the SACE perspective that are really important when it comes to responding to non-consensual photo sharing. So just like with responding to any type of situation where somebody's had their sexual boundaries violated, we want to encourage a few key things like holding space for youth, active listening so that they can tell their story in whatever words that they feel comfortable, where they can explore emotions. So really opening up that space for them to be heard. We also want to convey really key messages of I believe you, because often people are worried that they won't be believed, and that can really impact healing. We also want to let them know that it's not their fault. The only person who's to blame is the person who pressured them for that image, the person who shared that image without their consent. There is also a few really common and key messages that, or elements of responding to a disclosure of non-consensual photo sharing that are specific to it that I want us to keep in mind. So the first is understanding the issue. Just like Grace and Carrie said, we want to understand where these youth are going, how they are using these platforms, how they might be interacting with their peers, and approaching all this from a way where we have accurate information, like the information that you've garnered from or gleaned from this presentation. And having non-victim blaming information can be really, really key in making sure that the youth are supported and on a healing trajectory. We also want to withhold judgment, and this can mean a couple of things. So we want to withhold judgment around the circumstances surrounding the abuse. So we might look at a case where photos have been shared and think, why, how could they do that, that sort of thing. But as Grace and Carrie have alluded to, we are operating as adults with fully formed, functioning, logical brains, well, sometimes more logical than others, right? But teens are operating from a place of impulsivity and emotions, so they lack the full ability to predict long-term consequences for their actions. So for that reason, technology and teen brain development are kind of fundamentally at odds with each other, because with technology, it happens really rapidly. There's less opportunity for intervention. There's less opportunity for rethinking decisions. And the way that we often explore this difference is with the idea of what would you have to do to send a nude back in the day where everything was film cameras or Polaroids. You would have to put the postage on, you would have to put the address on, you would have to maybe write a note along with it, right? So all of this is different points where somebody can consider what might be the potential consequences, whereas when somebody sends a photo over social media or through the internet or through phones, that can all happen very quickly. We also want to withhold judgment around sexual experimentation with peers online. So I want to emphasize that this is not inherently unhealthy, but like all forms of sexual experimentation, it can be abusive. So young people have been given powerful pieces of technology, and we just assume that they know how to use them in a responsible way. So we definitely need to be engaging in open dialogue and providing youth with guidance on how to use technology in a safe way, and to really let them know that we are an ally in that and that we are there to support them. But we also need to keep in mind that it's really normal that youth are using technology to explore their sexuality, especially with their peers, because this is, once again, something that has extended into all aspects of our lives. And I want to say that we also need to withhold judgment on dependence of technology for relationships that youth have. Because if we look a little bit deeper at young adults' development, it's really focused on the development of peer relationships, achieving independence from family, establishing personal identity, and gaining acceptance of their body image. And a lot of the ways that youth use social media and they use the internet can facilitate all of these things. So social media and the internet can be really positive in the way that they support youth, but as my fellow presenters have discussed, it can also be extremely abusive. It can be a dangerous place for youth to be as well. But it's not surprising that youth have some dependence on technology for forming these relationships, because it's really meeting a biological need that they have to find connections and their place in the world. The last piece on this slide that I want to highlight in terms of supportive responses is we need to empower with information. So I feel like my fellow presenters have done a really good job of talking about this, but youth need to have people in their lives that they can have discussions with, particularly adults that they trust, where they can have discussions about what are their boundaries. And we need to be able to give them accurate and empowering information to make educated decisions about what they choose to do on social media, and to know what their rights and responsibilities are for all types of sexual contact, whether that be online or not. So you can let them know that regardless of how many of their peers they think are engaging in this, and even if all their friends are engaging in this, they have the right to make decisions about their own boundaries, and they don't have to engage in this type of behavior. We also want to ask questions of them, like questions that treat them as people who have some insight into a world that as adults, we might not have a lot of insight into. So asking them, do you know what sexting is? How would you feel if somebody sent you a nude? How would you feel, or what would you do if you received a photo from somebody that you didn't want to receive, or you received a photo of somebody who wasn't the person who sent it? What might you do to stop the spread of that image? We also want to help youth to understand, once again, that they have the right to say no, but also we want to really emphasize with our youth that they have to respect a no if that is something that somebody that they are engaging in any type of relationship with, they're not owed a nude, they're not owed a photo, and that is the same with any type of sexual activity. So really drawing the parallels between how consent works off the internet with how it works on the internet. It's pretty much the same standards regardless of where it's happening. So taking these steps, among others that I'm happy to discuss with you in the Q&A, can help youth to assert their boundaries and to help with their healing if their boundaries had been violated, but it also helps to create constructive norms within our communities, create a culture of consent where people know that respecting boundaries is, yeah, the expected norm. So the very last thing that I want to bring up with my portion of the presentation are some resources for youth if they've had their boundaries violated, as well as some that are specific to if photos have been shared without consent. So if you could go forward for me. The first is where I work. There's a sexual assault center of Edmonton. So we have counseling that's available to anyone ages 3 and up and to people of all genders. And we offer these services to people, even if what's happened to them happened a long time ago. So it doesn't have to be something that happened a week ago or yesterday. It can be something that happened 10 years ago. We also have a support and information line that is operated from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And this is a line that people can call if they've been impacted by this themselves. It's also a line for supporters if they have questions about how best to go about supporting somebody in their lives who has had their boundaries violated. There's also the Alberta One line for sexual violence, and this is a way that people can call from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Same thing with the SACE number to get information, to get support, and they can call into this line, they can text into this line, and there's also a feature on many sexual assault centers websites in the bottom right-hand corner on the SACE website, for instance, where people can chat as well with somebody who is a volunteer who can provide them with some of that support. There's also the Kids Help Phone, and this is a really good resource because it's 24 hours a day, and it's available for even kids or young adults in their 20s, and they have a chat feature that's available after school hours as well. There's the CHEW project. This is for LGBTQ2S plus youth who are in need of sensitive counseling, who are in need of getting access to supports that are specific to their identities, including housing supports, meeting their basic needs, things like that. There is getcybersafe.org or .gc.ca, I should say. So this has a lot of information that's similar to what I've shared with you today about how to stay safe in these types of situations. There's also needhelpnow.ca. So this is support for non-consensual photo sharing, information on how to get content removed from the internet, as well as help and emotional support for youth dealing with cyberbullying in all forms, including non-consensual photo sharing. With police, I'll just mention that there's no statute of limitations for reporting sexual violence of all forms, specifically sexual assault, as well as non-consensual photo sharing or child pornography. And a way that people can do this is through the website cybertip.ca. So this is a place where people can report online activity that is harmful to youth. This could include non-consensual photo sharing, as well as luring, extortion, and blackmail to send sexual images, as well as what my fellow presenters have talked about. This would be a place to report anything like that that's going on with youth as well. So I'm going to pass it back to my fellow presenters who are going to go through a few more resources that are specific to their agencies, as well as things that they know a little bit more about than myself, given their areas of expertise. So if we could go forward to the next slide.
Yep. So just to cover the top one, I'm here representing the Saffron Center. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's where I work. So this is the Sexual Assault Center out in Sherwood Park. So we also provide counseling, police and court support, and public education services for anyone who's interested. So just wanted to put our phone number and email up there if anyone has any further questions or is interested to contact anyone who works at Saffron. And I think Carrie will know more about the next two sources on there.
Yeah, so ACT Alberta does provide direct victim support for people who have been impacted by human trafficking. They are great and they provide public education, they provide victim services. So that's their contact information there if that is a need. And also if there is a child at risk who you believe is being sexually exploited, you can call the child abuse hotline. And we do have Andrea here from PASECA as well, who can answer any questions related to that legislation if needed. And then just the next slide, please, Peyton. And then this is all of our direct contact information. So we will do our best to answer through the Q&A questions if any have come in. But if people want to contact any of the three of us directly for more information or for follow-up or for education programs, then this is our direct information to do that. So I think I will turn it back to Lena and Kim, maybe, to do the Q&A.
Hi, perfect. Well, you guys covered absolutely, I think, all of the questions. One question that I did have come in, Carrie, when you were presenting, which Andrea may be able to help you in this one. How common is exploitation in young teen boys versus girls?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I don't have numbers. What I do have, I have a couple of links I can share if that's helpful to some data. There's a lot of data out there, and I think the most recent stuff I could find is about 5 years old. But what we do know is that about 70% of all victims are female under the age of 25. I don't know what that looks like in terms of under 18 for boys versus girls, but about 26% of that 70% is under 18. And then we do have some information around the average age for girls being exploited is 14 for underage and closer to 12 for boys. So it is happening for boys at a lot younger age. I don't know if I post the links to the data, if that's helpful, if people can see that, or if we can share it in some other way. But yeah, maybe Andrea has more information on that.
So I don't have specific statistics. I will say that I think probably the representation of males versus females is underrepresented. So I don't think we probably know how many young males are being exploited. Definitely the majority of youth that we work with are female, but we do have a number of clients who are males. And I wish I knew the answer to kind of why that is. I'm sure that there's lots of cultural and lots of social and systemic reasons for that, and probably some of the insight into that information too. But we do know it's underrepresented, and yeah, definitely something we need to try to figure out and work on.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot more underground too, right? So it's more off the grid than young girls. So, and it's amazing because that was essentially the only question I had, because you guys were fabulous and covered everything, other than people wanted copies. And of course, Clayton and I had talked about this, so this won't be ready until next week. So once it's ready, I can definitely get it out to folks, and the links, if you guys want to email me some links, I can just toss those in too and make sure folks get a copy.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I just want to say that we know with sexual exploitation, as well as people being extorted in any way online, that when they don't have open dialogues of communication with the adults in their lives, when they don't have those supports, then they are more vulnerable to that. So I just want to add that trans youth, youth who are gender nonconforming, youth who are LGBTQ2S+, who don't have those healthy ways to explore their sexuality or have those open conversations with the adult in their lives, are really vulnerable to this type of exploitation as well. So it's not just, you know, male, female either. We also need to be thinking of gender nonconforming.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. We have a question coming in here. Are there kid-friendly videos out there that we can show a 12-year-old to help teach them?
Specifically on what, I guess would be my question. I think there's lots out there. It just really depends on like, are you looking for
on internet safety?
Just generally? Yeah, maybe Grace or Scott might be able to answer that.
Well, Scott, I don't know if you're talking, but I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. So what I would say is Kids Help Phone has a lot of really great resources on internet safety and photo sharing and things like that. There's also needhelpnow.ca has a lot of really good information, as well as getcybersafe.gc.ca. Some of the resources that were up on the last slide that I shared has some really great resources that are accessible to people of all ages. There's some content that's geared towards adult, but there's definitely some that are geared towards youth as well.
So
Anything?
perhaps, Kim, when we post the link to this webinar on the SEWG website, we can put some of those links there as well for people.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that concludes it. We have no more questions coming in, but like I said, you guys did a really good job and you covered all the content. So thank you for everybody that was here today. And does the panel have anything else they want to add? No?
Thanks everyone for coming and listening to us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks everybody who was involved in putting this on as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day. And tomorrow's Friday. Yay! Thank you. Bye.
Bye.